it's hard to see the truth of your actions when your salary depends on not seeing them, and when the consequences of those actions are so far removed from the moment of decision. And I've been there, and it's not an easy place to be, because it doesn't happen suddenly. It happens very, very slowly. You start off working in an environment that you find hopeful and positive. And then gradually the priorities shift from behind you, or gradually you become more and more aware of the practical and the real versus the story and the myth or the promise. And then as you do so, the cognitive dissonance increases, and it manifests. It manifests with sadness. It manifests with depression. It manifests with anxiety. And it can
substance abuse as well, I think, as well. You can add to
and
that.
then at some point, sure, absolutely. Escapism, all forms of escapism, whether through substances, through trying not to think, through sports, through TV, through whatever. And then at some point, the cognitive dissonance becomes either overwhelming, or you find a way to maintain permanent escape by numbing yourself to everything. I don't think that's sustainable.
It's hard work being in denial, though. Is that what you're saying? Because
it's very hard work. Yeah, it's very hard work to operate in an environment that, at some level, is in complete contradiction with your principles, where your idea of yourself as a good person is being challenged every single day by the glimpses you get of the consequences of your actions, until one day you can't sustain it anymore. In my case, I had a brilliant moment where I was asked to censor my public speech in order to get a contract. And at that moment, it all kind of crystallized, and I realized that through repeated compromises, I had found myself feeding the very beast that I, couldn't support in principle. And I had to do a dramatic change in my priorities and my actions. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult even for people who are aware. And most people really, have other things to do than think about these things. They have practical matters.
Well, they think they do.
Soccer practice well, they think they do. Yes. It's very easy to get distracted by the minutiae of life on a daily basis and not pay attention to where you're going, and then look up and 10 years have passed.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, I wanted to say that really that denial isn't ignorance. It's knowing what the truth is and actively choosing not to see it. And you're absolutely right that we are almost numbed, particularly by some of the sort of major economic calamities of late. Like, birth begins with negation. It begins with a prosecution of the past and a hope of what could be, of what could come out of it. A hope past will be remembered differently, I think. The past hasn't finished happening, in a sense. We always have time to recontextualize and re-understand it in new ways. And it wasn't even that new. I mean, maybe we should just go over a little bit about what this fundamentally is. It is a global dialogue with a memory. It is a global self-stabilizing consensus. And it's backed ultimately, if you're looking for any kind of backing or intrinsic value, if you must, it's backed against the best understanding we have of the laws of physics. Because we wouldn't have computers at all if it weren't for the quantum revolution around the 1920s. And that is, physics is about asking questions about strange phenomena in our world. It's about building patterns that allow us to be able to circumnavigate our world without falling over, without becoming disorientated, because it builds rules. It says, right, I can make a prediction that is deterministic, that if I put this input in, I'm going to get this output. Then, of course, we have to move up to the software layer. The software layer has to touch down at the physics at some point. And then you have come up with some if statements. You have to come up with some conditions. You need to say if this and this. And that's what we were just saying, I think, when we talked about the viscosity of money, a flow of capital, because it's not just money, it's also capital and the flow of things in our world. And at some point, this has to meet, I think, where a lot of people searching for intrinsic value get stuck is they fail to see, or they don't get as far as page 3 of the Bitcoin paper for a start, which is where the magic starts. This is where he talks the application of, I don't have it in front of me, actually, I didn't come that well prepared, but he starts to talk about the application of proof of work. And he brings together the physics and the mind. He brings together the needs of the mind, this need for, possibilities in the future, this need for freedom. I don't mean more freedom, more emancipation, like just freedom of movement type freedom. And he does by suggesting the idea, and he's quite tentative about it. Satoshi Nakamoto is quite tentative. He doesn't want to say for sure that rewarding somebody with a token on top of the network called a Bitcoin will ensure the actors will behave in an honest way, because you can either defraud the network or you can behave honestly and just apply more processing power to support the robustness of the network in exchange for the reward than it would be for you to, for example, tell your own story on the network, for you to 51% or compromise it in another way. And he's not entirely sure. If you look at the language very closely, he says it ought to. He's quite equivocal. He wants to leave himself some room later on. Maybe we shouldn't take the hash rate for granted. But for now, this is a good enough model. And what this is truth is repetition, or at least truth is as good as you're going to get. It's repetition. And
so let's talk a bit about the truth behind this, because that's another, I think, very interesting thing about Bitcoin. When you first look at Bitcoin, it's a currency, it's money, it's digital money. That really misses the point. Then you've got a network and an implementation, which is essentially a piece of software. And behind that, you've got a community of people. But underlying all of this is the blockchain technology. And as a technology, it's more useful, I think, to think of the blockchain as a design pattern. It's a new design pattern for distributed systems. It's a design pattern that takes the traditional model of concentric circles around a root of trust and authority with increasing access control as you go out, and moats or walls set around a central authority, and it inverts it completely. And it actually makes the authority reside at the edges of the network through this process of collaboration. And it makes that authority cumulative, so that the more people participate, authority is achieved at ever higher rates with every passing block, with every increase in the hashing power, with every increase in the constituency of users. Network effect creates authority and trust in a highly diffuse and distributed manner, which also makes it very difficult to exploit, because there's no single thing that you can take down. And this narrative is very difficult for people to understand, primarily because authority has never been diffuse. Authority has always been centralized in most systems. It is a model that's worked very well, but is a model rooted in physical power and force. And it is the outcome of the centralization of physical power. In decentralized systems like Bitcoin, you invert that trust model, and where previously you had to trust everyone who had access, and therefore very few people could have access. In a decentralized system, you trust no one. You trust the design pattern. You trust the math. You trust the self-adapting system to reach equilibrium states in which reward for consensus is greater than reward for fraud. And in that equilibrium, the system is not only self-sustaining, but it's also completely open. You don't need access control. You don't need secrecy. You don't need vetting. When you trust no one but the design pattern, you can allow everyone to access. And so it completely inverts the trust model. And it creates this new environment where through this diffuse authority, you can establish trust across massive scale with massive participation. But here's the problem. You can't explain that. It's very difficult to explain that narrative because people intrinsically or intuitively associate authority with centralization because that's the only authority model they've ever seen. So when you say, well, Bitcoin has no center, and people will ask, well, okay, yes, I understand how it has no center, but who runs it? It doesn't have a center. Yeah, yes, okay, but who controls it? Well, it isn't controlled by anyone. It's really a collaborative function. Okay, but could someone take over the controls? Well, there are no controls to take over. There is no center or any levers of power at the center that someone could take over. And so you go into this circular discussion where people are grasping for the central authority, whether that's a system that's running it, a lever of power that can be pulled by someone, or even an authority figure who is Satoshi. And what do you mean it doesn't matter who Satoshi is? Of course it matters. What are the motivations of the creator of this thing? And that's a very interesting question because that is a question born of a centralized authority model. Because when authority is derived by the creator of the system, when authority is derived by who issued the currency, not who uses it, then the motives of the issuer matter because the issuer still has their hand on the levers of control. The motives of the issuer matter very much. The trustworthiness of the issuer matters because they can exert control into the future of that system. And every centralized authority system we've known requires us to trust a certain authority. The root of trust is sitting at the center. And so with Bitcoin, you pull back the curtain.
Well, the question, it doesn't make sense to ask, who is in charge because everyone's a masternode.
But that's an unsatisfactory answer because the context in which the question is asked is so steeped in certain assumptions about how authority and trust works. Because the only two models we've seen so far are either authority vested in a single individual or authority vested in a hierarchical organization designed to distribute that authority through checks and balances implemented through process. So we use organizational and process tools to control authority, to diffuse it, whether that's the US Constitution creating a three-tier government or a three-part government with checks and balances, whether it's a corporate governance board where a board of directors vies for power against the chief executive officer to create balance, essentially to unvest the individual and instead to vest the process with a higher level of trust because the process is not as easily corruptible. And then we've taken this a step further, and now we're vesting authority in the design pattern, and we're diffusing the authority completely until there is no center, not even an organization. And that's a very difficult leap for people to make. It's just as difficult as it was in the Middle Ages for people to think, well, if we get free, if we give up on the king, if we take away royalty, how do we make decisions? How can we possibly make decisions if every peasant has an opinion? How can we possibly create society at scale without a king? And it was very difficult for people to understand that. Democracy wasn't just hampered because the king didn't want it. It was also primarily hampered because the peasant themselves weren't, like, hey, this idea sounds pretty weird to me. At least that guy up there in the castle, I know who he is. I know where he lives. If he gets too out of control, we might actually have one of his relatives kill him and take over, as usually happens. But this idea of diffuse authority given to the people sounds pretty strange and radical. There was as much resistance.
Well, look at what democracy is. So essentially, democracy means people and power together. It's a very, very costly model to implement. And it came about, it was an innovation of Cleisthenes, an ancient Greek ruler, or at least he was the guy that put in the reforms, and that he's the one that gets the credit. But he did it in response to the mob. This isn't a government formed in a classroom out of theory. This is out of necessity. And what it did is it gave the people of Athens, ancient Athens, a sense of autonomy and a sense of self-directedness in a way that, we look back at now and just go in awe. I mean, it's one of the most successful civilizations in the human story. And it's remarkable that it got lost as a system of governance for so long. And now we're getting back. But this is all to do with the relationship between the sophos and the demos, the experts and people. When I have some information that you don't have that you need, I am encumbered. I have a responsibility. Do I use it for my own private ends, or do I use it to help you? It's a choice that I have to make. It's not, I don't have a choice about the choice, if you like. And even if I choose to act dishonestly, I've still got to live with that truth myself later on. And I don't think that we can always get away. This is something that comes up in Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. When we commit our crimes, we pay for them twice, once in the punishment that society gives us, and again, of course, myself, that I punish myself for the things that I've done wrong. I think we need to just be a little bit careful that we don't talk about this centralization, decentralization continuum into a moral issue. What was morally reprehensible at the banks was not how they organized themselves per se. It was the actions of the individuals themselves. And in fact, because like I say, democracy is an expensive system to implement. It's very costly. So mostly it's subject to the availability of resources as to whether you can be fully decentralized. But actually, I think it speaks to, who are the good bankers? Who are the people who
It's a matter of scale, Chris. I mean, I think that's the bottom line, in that, if we look at banks today and what they're doing is they're failing to scale trust because they are vulnerable to large systemic effects. But that is something that happened over time. If you go back to the 16th century, when you see the first commercial institutions evolve from out of the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company and all of the expeditions that were happening, and the creation of the modern corporation, the creation of a modern open banking system, the creation of the modern stock markets, and the ability for individuals to invest in corporations, which up to then were royal charters. The investors were the aristocracy, and only the aristocracy. And it wasn't because of a lack of money. It was about, the scale, the ability to scale these institutions. So if you look at banks then, they took something that was only the purview of kings, and they gave it to, let's say today, 1 billion, maybe 2 billion people have the economic tools that only kings had in the 16th century. So banking was a huge equalizer. It was a system of equalization and meritocracy. The modern currencies, the same thing. The modern corporation, the same thing. All of these were systems that flattened power, that took it out of a pyramid structure and squashed it. But what happens over time? As the base of this system gets wider and wider and wider, it starts looking like a pyramid again. It fails to scale. And what we've seen now is really the egalitarian moves of these systems, or the egalitarian impact of these systems gradually diminishing over time until it starts operating contrary to egalitarian principles and starts reconcentrating power. And that's really a failure to scale the system. It's a failure to make the pyramid flat, so it starts getting pointier and pointier. What Bitcoin does is it simply unlocks the next level of scale. It's like achievement unlocked. You manage to go from the 1,000 kings to the 1 billion peasants level of economic scale. Cryptocurrencies will take us from the 1 billion peasants to the 7 billion human level of scale, because we can scale them better. And at some point, they're also going to fail to scale. And we're going to need to disrupt that pyramid too. I mean, that is the endless cycle of change. That is the entropic nature of the universe. The things that start off as great egalitarian forces end up becoming power systems.
That's great. That's a wonderful exegesis there. And I would say, yes, it's about understanding the small in relation to the big. This is about bringing together the public and the private interests. So you have the local private interests of my desire to make money. Then you have the public interest, which needs stability. It needs consensus. It needs a form of agreement. And that's what the blockchain network does. That's for me, that's what I find important about it. And that's why I think it has intrinsic value. So you talked about scale, and maybe that should bring us on to the socioeconomic implications, particularly the sociology, because a trustless network doesn't rid us of the need for trust. On the contrary, it actually makes trust more important. And in particular, you should probably, and your listeners should probably look up at the idea of stranger interaction in sociology. And this is the chances that we take on each other before we know each other. Those kind of thin slice, if you also look, that's another key word, okay? We all walk around with a very, very thin slice of information about the world. And yet, I've still been here for more than 3 decades and I'm doing pretty well, even though I don't have very much information on what's going on.
BitGive Foundation is a non-profit charitable giving organization leveraging the power of the Bitcoin community to improve public health and the environment worldwide. Help us demonstrate the significant impact of Bitcoin in addressing these critical issues on a global scale. Support international giving in Bitcoin. Please visit our website at www.bitgivefoundation.org. That's www.bitgivefoundation.org.